Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We're right now into the next session of Palestine through a decolonial lens. In this program and in this process, we attempt to look at Palestine history as well as the contemporary period while deciphering some of the salient points in such a way that we're able to get some grounding relative to the issue of Palestine. What I wanted to do today is to focus on Palestine during the Trump era, that we are dealing with a very distinctive change in the U.S. administration approach to the Palestine crisis or the Palestine question in its totality. This is not to imply that the earlier history of successive U.S. administration has been favorable to the Palestinians, but there is both a qualitative change in the current Trump administration relative to Palestine and also a quantitative shift as well in relations to the various issues that are there. In addition, Palestine in the Trump era both has a continuation of domestic surveillance and domestic impact in the United States on those who are active on the Palestine front, especially with the appointment in the Department of Education or Civil Rights Division that will begin to focus more on criminalizing and targeting pro-Palestine activists and pro-Palestine individuals in various settings within the academic arena and broadly also in society by criminalizing the BDS as well as pro-Palestine activism in general. So let me first take the issue about in terms of Trump and the influences on Trump that early on in Trump's campaign, he was not as much committed to Israel. Actually, he was very much almost a non-committal, specifically on the question of foreign aid, on the question of Israel. But that doesn't mean that he didn't do a very quick turnaround and a quick study. And in particular, the impact of Sheldon Adelson's financial contribution and also the coalescing of a cluster of extreme right-wing pro-Israel activists in the United States, as well as Netanyahu's position vis-a-vis Trump, that Trump in a very short period of time shifted and embraced the pillars of pro-Israel political lines within the U.S. party politic, which focused again on abandonment of the peace process, and this has been a point present in pro-Israel work in the U.S. for quite some time, contrary to popular opinion, that the abandonment of peace process has been at the intersection of pro-Israel work in the U.S. Without having to take the public relations effort, which is investing in peace or embracing peace or wanting peace, while in reality the structural approach to peace in the United States or work toward peace for the United States has been always to derail and support the most right-wing aspect of the Israeli politics, including the constant expansion of settlements, the successive attacks on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, as well as the attacks on the West Bank. So again, Trump shifted his position and embraced Adelson, who contributed considerably to Trump's campaign. Again, the evidence shows that Adelson's contribution to Trump's campaign is over $80 million that was contributed to the Republican causes in general, but also with a heavy piece of it going to the Trump campaign. In addition, just for the inauguration, Adelson put in $5 million for Trump's inauguration. And just a couple of weeks after the election, actually, Adelson met with Trump in the Trump Tower in New York with the specific demand of moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And then the talking point of delinking the movement of U.S. embassy from the broader peace process as a part of a final agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, which essentially became the effective talking points of the Trump administration moving forward. And then the players that were put together to oversee the peace process, quote, between two parentheses, from the appointment of the ambassador to Jared Kushner to Greenblatt, meaning that the team that is basically dealing with the Palestinians is not only coming from the extreme right-wing political spectrum, but they're heavily committed to a U.S. worldview where Israel is central to any move vis-a-vis the broader issues relative to Palestine and the Middle East in general. Which gets us into that Trump's moves in relations to Palestine essentially are Netanyahu's move or Netanyahu's agenda that is packaged within an American framework and being set to implementation by individuals that have had a long-term commitment not only to Zionism in the theoretical but also Zionism in relations to policy. Individuals like Dave Friedman, who is committed to supporting settlements and continued settlement expansion, rejected the peace process from the get-go and continued to actually actively support forces inside Israel that are resistant to the peace process. And then roll into this Jared Kushner, who's also working on his own particular deal within the Palestine-Israel portfolio, but broadly also connected to his broader interest in engaging in the region as a whole vis-a-vis the Gulf states, Iran, and in general. So this gets us that Palestine, as far as the Trump's era is concerned, is articulated that it is Israel directed agenda, that the priority is to actually give Israel all what it needs in relations to putting it ahead of Palestinians' basic demands, basic human rights, basic call for end to occupation, basic challenge to the settlement. So all of the priorities that Israel wanted is on the table from Trump's era, not in essence only to speak in rhetorically, but actually in implementation. Adelson himself, that he was tired or at least impatient that the U.S. administration have not actually moved quicker on moving the embassy. So in essence, for Trump, the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem is a political decision that is motivated by domestic consideration for his election and also the election coming forth in order to secure both financial and economic support as well as possibly have a deeper level of political alliances with the extreme right wing of the Zionist movement within the United States. So he's looking through a political calculus domestically in the United States and not necessarily thinking only from a diplomatic lens. Nobody would accuse Trump of being diplomatic, even if you have an extension or a wide imagination, that he is purely thinking of self-interest and a very narrow self-interest in this aspect. Now, this departure also points to that the downgrading of Palestine as an issue vis-a-vis U.S. diplomatic infrastructure and arena. Some of that is reflected again in the moves for the Jerusalem. The second is reflected in an open-ended permissibility, or in essence support for the expansion of settlements and confiscation of more lands and properties in occupied Palestine, which is something that we're already seeing. It's actually, we are, rather than seeing the previous U.S. administrations, problematic as they were, and again, and here I'm not gonna spend some time to say that successive administrations have mounted any real defense of the Palestinians, but we saw the shifts that for the longest period that the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank in particular, that settlement expansion, at a certain point it was deemed during even the Reagan era to be in violation of international law and against U.S. interests, to shift during the late part of the Clinton administration into the Bush administration, where it was seen to be impediment to peace. And we saw that was something that Obama himself, during the last weeks of his administration, affirmed the illegality of the settlements with the United Nations Security Council resolution, which the U.S. abstained. But now the Trump administration is basically saying the Israeli position that the West Bank is a disputed territory, and as such the disputed territory is permitted to be accessible for settlements, expansion settlements, and increasing Israeli footprint. And I think this mirrors the Israeli Knesset vote that has begun to shift to actually call for the annexation of the West Bank, which again is bringing to an end the so-called two-state solution. So the Trump administration have again shifted from the occupied territories being deemed occupied into an effective lifting the cover on the permissibility of settlements, expansion of settlement, even though that settlement expansion has been going on from the mid-70s unabated. But it was, again, with the U.S. administration, successive administration, that were often winking one way of illegality while funding successively foreign aid to Israel. So this is on the Palestine has become a secondary issue relative to the United States in terms of its commitment to Palestine, and putting Israel at the forefront to actually undertake and do whatever it wants without any counter pressure being mounted on this sense. The third aspect in terms of Palestine in the Trump's era is as a result of the downgrading of the approach to Palestine, and also centering the conflict or centering the challenge to Iran, this results in that Israel is being seen as the regional power broker and also the regional stabilizer for the current defragmented Arab world, with a particular emphasis on the Gulf, Egypt, and other areas. And as such, the Palestine file has been degraded to the more regional strategic consideration, where Israel is given total freedom of operation with the full support of a U.S. administration, both in terms of Trump, in terms of the United Nations, U.S. representative of the United Nations, Jared Kushner, even from the State Department, even though there is some tension in there. But for all intensive purposes, Israel is having a free regional hand to undertake an effective policy, where it's actually it acts as a broker to further the brokenness of the region, to favor its own interest and remove any possibility of a Palestinian or support for the Palestinians in a real way that would alter the standing of Israel relative to Palestine in the days and months and year ahead. This is again very evidence for us in the many delegations, at least also from American national American Zionist figures that have been given the red carpet in many parts of the Arab world these days, because they're seen as the conduit for essentially being the power brokers and the diplomatic / political brokers in a region where Israel now is essentially the regional hegemon, supported by the major power, which is the United States at this particular time. So Trump has no compulsion at this point, or no interest in actually creating or even giving the perception of creation that there is any type of a balance in approach. Earlier administration at least gave the perception that they're actually approaching Palestine, Israel in somewhat of an even-handed. But again, even-handedness in U.S. policy means that if Israel gets 10 points, Palestinians get -10, and that is what even-handedness is about. But that today, even giving the Palestinians -10 in that relationship, it seems too much. So it's basically possibly -100, if even considering Palestinians as a factor in these dynamics. So again, in here, Palestine in the Trump era has been completely and considerably downgraded in relations to the set of priorities and the issues that needs to be dealt with, which is precisely what Israel has been saying all along, or been calling for all along, that the strategic issues in the region has nothing to do with Israel and the Palestinians. It's all these other issues that we need to settle, and basically it becomes a project that we need to resolve all the conflicts in the region, and also call for bilateral agreements between Israel and every Arab and Muslim countries before we could come back to resolve the Palestinian issue, and it becomes only a purely demographic and economic issue. And this is also reflects on the broader strategy of Israel's talking about an economic peace or an economic investment, which is reflected here in some of the local or internal dynamic in the United States among various Zionist organizations that are calling for investing in peace rather than actually working for justice in order to achieve peace, which has been all along the case. So that's at least the picture that we're seeing. Last aspect to this approach to Palestine from the Trump administration is that a mounted pressure is being applied to the Palestinians in order for them to accept whatever is being placed as the deal of the century that Trump has been speaking about. And let me be very clear. The deal of the century is basically Netanyahu's dream of completely eviscerating the Palestinian possibility of sovereignty, of independence, of freedom, of dignity, and it is being packaged through the work of Kushner, Friedman, Greenblatt, as well as the urging of Adelson and others who want to see that Palestine is no longer an issue that would inhibit Israel from achieving its, again, greater Israel idea from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, and in essence also pushing the notion of an alternative Palestine, which is currently would be thought of as Jordan. So in essence, the move toward this is moving in that direction, and whatever Palestinian population will remain in the current Palestine, West Bank, and Gaza will be given possibly an expanded autonomy or autonomous aspect in a sense of the homelands in South Africa, but nothing more. And this is essentially the package of the deal of the century that is being pressed on the Palestinians. And in order to make the pressure even more, this is where the discussions about removing or the United States withholding the funding from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, that have been supporting the largest refugee population that have existed up to the period of the Syrian civil war, which is the Palestinian refugee population. So they're mounting, essentially saying, or putting the food and the possibility of access to food to the Palestinians and livelihood as the way to try to extract an acceptance or an agreement from the Palestinians to accept the unacceptable, which is to accept them to be removed from history with their own concession to it in this process. So this is the dynamics, that the pressure that is being mounted. The United Nations, the removal of funding from UNRWA from the U.S., also I would say the demonization of UNRWA that has been taking place by a number of years by many of those who are active on the pro-Israel side, including the Israeli government, that have constantly demonized UNRWA, rather than actually Israel being responsible for and being demanded to fulfill its obligation under the international law, that these refugees, or the Palestinian refugees, it's its own creation, and the occupation of its own creation, that it actually should be responsible for spending on its occupation. But in essence, what we have is a five-star occupation where you actually occupy people and make them pay for their own occupation. This is the oddity of the period that we are living in. So in essence, this is pressure that's being mounted on the Palestinians in relations to what is taking place. Now, I want to leave the region Palestine in order for me to move to the United States. As we see, there's been a number of efforts on the local, state level, as well as at the federal level, to criminalize Palestinians, political activists, to criminalize PDS, to silence them, to entangle them in a variety of legal processes, including the whole lawfare project that is being underway, to target academics that are in the universities, to target organizations and non-profit organizations, as well as civic leaders, in such a way to silence them internally in the United States. And I think this has an impact, in essence, on the ability and the continued ability to challenge the basic Zionist narrative in relations to Palestine. And I think what we need in this coming cycle is to realize that this domestic international alignment that has been clustered around Israel's demand of silencing Palestinians, including a whole ministry that is engaged in attempting to silence the PDS activists, is being infused to the Trump administration in such a way that this would be part of the package of Palestine during the Trump era, that it had have a domestic component that is attached to this criminalization effort. So in the days and months ahead, we have to be aware of these dynamics and how part of the structure is creating divisions among the broader progressive forces, also divisions among the Arab and Muslim communities in this country. And this is also in terms of the strategy of creating normalization, of creating the good Muslim, the good Arab, the good Palestinian, meaning that who accepts the Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinian narrative, and without actually centering justice and ending the occupation, centering dignity and freedom for the Palestinians, before we actually get into discussions about whether we all have a commonality. So increasingly, this avenue that is of normalization, of saying that there is something acceptable of the continuation of the status quo, is part and parcel. So creating what's called a good Arab, a good Muslim, a good Palestinian, or a good progressive that becomes a progressive except on Palestine, progressive except on PDS, progressive except on ending the occupation. And for this type of dynamics, then many avenues are being entertained to cluster or to bring forth individuals that might be upwardly mobile, thinking that their doors going to be open for them, doors of opportunity, if they engage in this type of discourse. And I think there's a number of these projects that are underway, and they are confusing resisting Islamophobia, confusing resisting the Trump's era, refusing resisting immigration, confusing all these internal dynamics with an acceptability or a packaging acceptability of the permanency and the expansion of Zionism and the expansion of Israel's aggression on the Palestinians. And I think in here what we need to say that if you want to articulate a justice-based agenda, it has to be a justice-based agenda that is indivisible, that actually takes account of those responsibilities in such a way that does not leave the Palestinians once again out in the open. This has a long history in the politics here in the United States. At a certain point in the 80s, you could actually articulate and have a mobilization for jobs, labor, and justice, and Palestinians will not be even allowed to actually be on the stage, let alone be able to speak. Let me say for clearly, those days in the United States and other places are gone. And therefore, if we want to speak about an inclusive, justice-based agenda, Palestine and the Palestinian struggle is central to it, and that critique of the movement that attempts to create a perception of inclusion while excluding no longer has to be allowed to take hold, especially at a time where the Muslim ban, where at a time where the surveillance of Muslim communities, where at a time where the discussions about who belongs and doesn't belong, Palestine actually is centrally located in there. Just look at all this conceptualization of surveillance and what are the rationale. In many places, if you speak on Palestine, whether in here or in Europe, then you are susceptible to being surveilled. Meaning that the rights of Palestinians in Palestine are connected to the rights of Palestinians and progressives and those who are adhering to seeing a different world. They are connected, even though that we attempt to structurally disconnect them. So as we mobilize to resist Trump, as we mobilize to challenge the Trump agenda, specifically on the Palestine issue, we have to constantly be at guard and aware of the various processes, various projects that are being undertaken, especially, and again I'm speaking here as a person who works on Islamophobia very much so on 24/7. There are many that are attempting to try to get engaged on the issue of Islamophobia to defend Arab and Muslims and so on, while at the same time violating the rights of the Palestinians. For me, that is a non-starter as an approach. You cannot defend a Muslim Arab rights without actually want them to speak on that which is critical, and Palestine is that which is very critical in the broader Arab and Muslim community in there. And therefore, what we need is to be very clear about these processes domestically in order to say that Palestine in the Trump era is both being violated internationally as well as domestically, and I think increasingly many people are beginning to be aware of this, especially among the broader mobilization that has taken place in the United States. So again, to sum up my talk with you today, and hopefully again, I always welcome your questions, your comments on Facebook, Instagram, and so on. But again, let me emphasize, I welcome questions, comments, and if you use language that is unacceptable, expect the button of delete to be utilized and accept to be blocked, because I'm not interested in people. I think if you want to go to the bottom of the barrel, there's always some people that you could seek in other parts of the world. This is not the place for it. And if you also want to entertain your own what you call delusions, I encourage you, there are many Facebook pages that could actually center your delusions. This is not the place for it to do so. So again, I encourage questions, encourage comments and engagement, and therefore if you do so, then expect that button to be hit very quickly in order for us to actually have a sound discussions and sound engagement. Debate is welcome, engagement is welcome, comments are welcome, but offensive language and anything of that sort will not be tolerated at all and therefore I encourage you to do so. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being with us today, and look forward to meeting you again next week in another session that would look at BDS in particular in a much more focused way. So we'll actually begin to discuss what are the modes of solidarity that we need to engage in the years and days ahead. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.